The mainstream media has lost its ability to be objective. That's one of the reasons I became a journalist in the first place a few years ago, is because I want people to have access to more accurate information, especially on this topic. Started working at conservative outlets because there was no other place where you could publish something that was even remotely critical of the gender-affirming model of care and the current sort of transgender narrative.
Does that frustrate you as a liberal that the left side of the spectrum, for want of a better way of putting it, let's just use that terminology for the moment, that they were so slow to challenge what was happening?
They're not doing their jobs. They're supposed to be journalists. Journalists have just basically been acting as activist mouthpieces. I mean, Jesse Singal pointed this out the other week, where there's a stock sentence that CNN.com will use, and it's in dozens and dozens of articles, stating that gender-affirming care is medically necessary and evidence-based. Those words have meaning, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're lying to people. It's junk science, absolute junk science. Use the term gender pseudoscience. I've been passionate about science and debunking pseudoscience for over 12 years. My focus now is on what I call gender pseudoscience and communicating what that is. And gender pseudoscience is unfounded scientific claims about innate gender identity and medical claims about the gender-affirming model of care that are presented as sound science, but in fact are not supported by any empirical evidence.
If you were talking to somebody who hasn't been paying attention, who thinks that the doctors and scientists have got this all under control, they must be doing everything right, what would be a kind of summary to explain what's really going on?
That's the difficult part, is it's not even just the medical organizations and the doctors. It's academia, it's research institutions, it's activist organizations like gay and civil rights organizations, mainstream media. They're all sort of complicit in promoting this particular narrative that gender-affirming care is life-saving, medically necessary, evidence-based. In a lot of ways, it's like other medical scandals we've seen in history, but in other ways, it's nothing like we've ever seen before.
So what are the similarities between former medical scandals and what is unique about this medical scandal?
I sometimes liken it to the opioid crisis that we saw. These pharmaceutical companies who took a study, it wasn't even a real study, but they used that to say their particular new brand of opioid wasn't addictive at all. They got it pushed through the FDA into clinics, and then we saw, they were called pill mills. There's these clinics that just popped up all over the country to meet patient demand rather than medical necessity. And that's kind of similar to what we're seeing with all these gender clinics. Like, there were virtually none like 15 years ago. Now there's at least 100 pediatric gender clinics and probably over 900 clinics that will prescribe medical interventions. So there are a lot of similarities to that.
And the differences? Why is this particular scandal unique?
Because it's sort of disguised, couched in social justice framework. People think it's sort of a continuation of the gay rights movement. Part of the other problem too is how mainstream media portrays it as something that only religious conservatives would oppose. So it's become highly polarized, and people readily dismiss any concerns anyone has, even me, a liberal. I regularly get called a bigot and a transphobe and anti-trans and anti-LGBT for saying that I believe all areas of medicine, including gender medicine, should be aligned with the principles of evidence-based medicine. And that's something that really should not be controversial at all. I think we all want what's best for these like vulnerable groups of people. They deserve so much better than the current treatment they're getting. I think that a lot of young people are encountering these narratives online and attributing symptoms that they may be experiencing from other things to a trans identity, and thinking that it's going to relieve them of their suffering and the distress they feel, because that part is very real. And I think they're just desperately looking for relief. They're finding it in the wrong places.
That's so interesting. So it's very understandable that young people who are distressed are looking for a way out, but then they're being presented with a solution for which there is no evidence that it actually makes their lives better. And in fact, for some of them, it makes it a lot worse.
Yes. That's what I'm finding. I've done surveys with detransitioners too, all of whom were just immediately affirmed in their trans identity. There was no differential diagnosis. They weren't exploring any other kinds of factors that could have been contributing to this. I mean, there's no other area of medicine where the doctor relies on the patient's self-diagnosis and then immediately affirms it and immediately refers them for medical interventions. There's nothing else like it.
Right, so if I came into a hospital and I said, I've got a cracked rib, can you do whatever you're supposed to do with a cracked rib? They wouldn't just like start injecting me with stuff. They would do an x-ray or whatever, right?
Exactly. You cannot question a gender identity because that's considered conversion therapy. And so a lot of doctors now are just immediately affirming this self-diagnosis.
And why do you think that is, Christina? Do you think that's because they've imbibed the ideology? Or do you think they're worried that they're going to be criticized or called transphobic or have professional opportunities curtailed?
Because it's considered the standard of care currently. That's what the gender-affirming model of care is. That's been endorsed by all of these medical organizations. It's in the American Academy of Pediatrics position statement. It's the immediate affirmation of their trans identity and then referrals for medical interventions.
What is the evidence on the efficacy of transition or social transition or any of these things that are being advocated as gender-affirming care? What is the evidence about their effectiveness?
All they have is very short-term follow-ups and low-quality studies that show maybe there's like a short-term benefit in improving their mood or something like that. If
you inject people with testosterone, especially stressed girls,
they're very low-quality studies that there's all kinds of other things. They also are getting psychotherapy at the same time. So it's very, very poor quality studies that show some kind of like short-term benefit. But what we see with detransition is that it typically takes between 4 to 8 years for regret to occur. And it's just terrible the way detransition is talked about in the mainstream media because it's mostly to downplay, diminish their experiences. All the time you see them citing studies on low rates of regret. These studies were on a completely different cohort than the ones that people are most concerned about today. They were on adults with a completely different model of care rather than adolescents who are under the gender-affirming model of care. The best research that we currently have comes from a comprehensive review of medical records from, I think, 2022 that showed about 30% of adolescents and young adults discontinued hormone use after about 4 years. And that's much higher than, the 1% studies that we sometimes see cited on the different cohort.
And in terms of regret, by the way, like I have a trouble admitting to my wife that I regret buying a t-shirt that I bought. Do you know what I mean? Like just instinctively, I would say that it's quite possible that not everyone who says in a survey, I don't have any regrets, actually has no regrets.
Exactly. Yeah. There is a bit of like a sunk cost fallacy that I think. I want people to be happy with the decisions they're making. I want people to be happy in the long term with their transition, but I don't see that being possible right now because people are being lied to about the nature of their condition. Gender dysphoria is a psychiatric condition with a high rate of desistance, but in my survey of detransitioners and desisters of a trans identity, I found that those who did get medical interventions, 85% said that their doctors and mental health professionals conceptualized their trans identity to them as a medical condition that required medical treatment or that being trans was a biological aspect that they had no control over. And they were not told that this was a psychiatric condition with a high rate of desistance. And I'm thinking, if I was in their position with the authority that a doctor has, that power imbalance between the doctor and patient, I would have transitioned too in their position. People are not receiving accurate information about their condition. Their doctors are lying to them.